Have you ever had an intense emotional reaction that just takes over everything and it really kind of blocks any other thoughts or feelings? It's just whoosh. And sometimes it might lead you to doing something or saying something that you later regret, or maybe it leads you to not doing something or not saying something that you later regret. Well, this is called an amygdala hijack, and it's basically when the fear center of your brain, the part of your brain that controls your fight, flight, and freeze response, takes over the rest of your brain and therefore takes over your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So this happens to everybody. And knowing about it and understanding it can really help you lower your emotional reactivity. And this video is going to focus on explaining what the amygdala hijack is, why it happens, why recognizing it helps. And then I will follow this video with another one that talks about specific management techniques to help lower that reactivity. In evolutionary terms, our amygdala is one of the oldest parts of our brain, and we share it with most other living beings. And one of its important roles is to make us react very quickly to serious physical danger. So, a wonderful example that most people can relate to with regard to how the amygdala works is if you are walking on a path and out of the corner of your eye, you see something and you think it might be a snake and you jump. Now, you have jumped, you have had an autonomic nervous system response probably before it's even registered that it might be a snake. Your jumping is immediate. So the sensory information comes in and the amygdala has you react very, very quickly. Now, in that example with the possible snake, you probably pause, take a second look, you see it's just a stick, and you can calm down. But that activation might remain for a little while. You might be feeling on edge, even though you know, hmm, just a stick. But if that actually was a snake and you live in an area with dangerous snakes, you would want to react that fast. So your brain is designed to keep you safe. So in that moment, when you spot a potential danger, your body reacts before it's confirmed, before the danger is confirmed. The information that gets to your frontal lobe that processes whether it's actually a danger or not takes a little bit more time. But another issue with our amygdala is that it cannot differentiate between an immediate physical survival based danger and somebody being mean to you, or somebody verbally attacking you, or a boss being unhappy with you, or needing to get up and make a public speech. Your amygdala does not differentiate between a social media post and a tiger attacking you. So, what does this mean? This means that our amygdala reacts to a lot of things that feel like very intense threats. And the amygdala is designed to take over the rest of the brain. The amygdala is designed to narrow your focus, pump adrenaline into your system, send blood and energy into your muscles so that you can flee, fight, or freeze. And it doesn't want you pausing in the middle of immediate danger. However, I think you already know where I'm going with this. When somebody is kind of being mean to us, but we're not in physical danger, we're still being flooded with all the same chemicals. The amygdala controls the autonomic nervous system and your physiological response before you're even consciously aware of it. So the amygdala operates sort of on an unconscious level. Like in that example with the possible snake that ends up being a stick, the amygdala has a better safe than sorry attitude. Better to keep you safe than to be sorry later. But if you're in a work situation where perhaps a colleague is criticizing you or your boss is criticizing you, you actually really need your full brain online to deal with the situation. I'm not saying it's not a difficult situation. And I know many people will say, well, it is a survival threat if my boss is going to fire me. But that's not the kind of survival threat that the amygdala is priming you to fight, flee, or freeze from. The amygdala is dealing with immediate, physically dangerous survival threats and getting you prepared to deal with them. So, if your amygdala gets triggered in a work meeting and your body is flooded with all of those chemicals, you will go into your preferred method, fight, flight, or freeze in that meeting. Instead of being able to stay present, be like, okay, this is really unpleasant. I don't like it, but I need my full brain online to deal with the situation. Same thing in a fight with your loved one, with your partner. Your partner has done something that's made you very upset. You express it. They get defensive. They get angry. They begin to attack you. You get more and more upset. It feels like a survival threat. Your amygdala has gone nuts. Your amygdala has taken over your entire brain. You either shut down if you're a freezer and you can't do anything, you can't say anything, you just totally freeze, or you fight, probably say things you regret later, or maybe do things you regret later, or maybe you flee and maybe you regret that later because your partner is very sensitive to when you run away. So when this amygdala hijack happens, it is taking over your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that does planning and risk assessment and looks into the future and can sort of logically go through decision making. That part of your brain might still be sort of working, but only in service to the amygdala. So if you are a fighter and you're a very articulate person, you might sound really, really rational during an amygdala hijack, but you might be so rational and pointed and with the sarcasm or the cutting remarks or the attacks, it's not conducive to a relationship, not conducive to a relationship with a loved one or with a boss or with a coworker. And another part of our brain that is taken over by the amygdala is the part of our brain that feels compassion and connection to other people. So when we go into that survival mode, there's no sense of relationship, right? I will often say, like, a reptile has an amygdala type response. Reptiles are not warm and cuddly. They will do whatever they need to do to survive. So that's another reason that amygdala hijacks can be so damaging to our relationships. Now, I see the amygdala hijack talked about a lot in terms of the fight response, right? So people who just attack and then get arrested for beating somebody up. But it also happens for people who are freezers and it happens with people who are fleers. So just know that no matter which one of those three things is your kind of go to survival mechanism, right? The amygdala hijack can cause that to take over and shut down the rest of your brain. And let's talk about triggers again for a moment, because in working with people as a psychotherapist over 20 years, as well as my own personal journey, I realized that most people have very specific triggers based on extremely upsetting, if not traumatic, experiences they have had in life, most likely early childhood. So, for example, if you had authority figures that were dangerous or not supportive, you might overreact in a situation with a boss who's an authority figure or maybe even a doctor, right? And the relationship gets triggered. And it's like this emotional memory is in our brain with no understanding of time, no understanding that the situation is different because the pattern is the same. Our emotional brain operates on patterns. So we have our amygdala triggering danger, danger, and our emotional response being pattern based. Been here before, this isn't going to go well. I better freeze, or I better run, or I better fight, right? For some people, driving on a crowded highway is a complete trigger that could take over their entire brain. For others, it might be public speaking or a performance based issue. And for many of us, Many, many, many of us. The amygdala is hijacked the most in our most important relationships. So I think we are wired to be connected to other people and to see that connection as a matter of survival. But it isn't a matter of immediate, right now, I have to run away from the saber-toothed tiger survival. It's longer term connection type relationship. And yes, it contributes to our happiness, but probably not to our immediate survival. And this is one reason that once, particularly when people get married, the fights can become so much more explosive because any threat to the relationship, any threat to the connection can be seen as a survival based threat. The amygdala takes over, and then it just doesn't go well from with either person. So I definitely want to mention that this term was coined by Daniel Goleman in his book Emotional Intelligence, and I'll show a picture here, and I'll put a link to the book in the description here because it's a great book. I highly recommend it. But he coined this term to describe something that all of us have experienced. It's basically part of how our brains are wired, but learning to manage it, learning to calm those triggers down, learning to lower and self soothe and calm our physiological responses is key to our emotional intelligence. And I think it's really helpful to know that our brain is wired to focus on the negative, to have these automatic survival responses so that we don't have to feel badly about ourselves. And so that we can then learn tools to help our lives be happier. And so much of how our individual brains are wired does have to do with our early conditioning. And I talk a lot about this in a free webinar that I have called Rewire Your Brain for Joy and Confidence. I'll put a little QR code here on the screen, and there'll be a link in the description to this webinar, but it really goes into more detail about how our behaviors, thoughts, emotions get wired together by repetition, but we have that neuroplasticity, so we can actually change the wiring through changing thoughts, behaviors. So many people have found that super helpful. I encourage you to take advantage of watching it. And then part two of this video is going to be on how to use techniques to manage those hijacks and eventually calm down enough so they almost never happen. All right, let me know what you think of this. Let me know what questions you have. Drop comments and I'll try to respond. See you next week.